So this might be familiar to some folks in here who've done Satipatthana with me before or with others before, but what I'd like to discuss this morning is the Bhikkhu Analayo's method of practicing mindfulness with anatomy in the Satipatthana Sutta. This isn't so much as a vibe talk, instead it's more like a very instructional, right? So I will read from the sutta, how it's written traditionally, and then talk a little bit about how Bhikkhu Analayo suggests practicing with it. I'll read from right here. So this is from the Satipatthana Sutta. If you're not familiar with it, it's the kind of like one of the primary scriptures, if you want to call it that, discourses of the Buddha that a lot of our mindfulness practices come from. Satipatthana means foundations of mindfulness, and it's divided into body, feeling tones, mind, and dharmas, and we are not going to talk about all of that today. What's important is that the first section, mindfulness with the body, is subdivided into all sorts of different ways of practicing with the body. Anatomy, elements, death, breathing, walking, sitting, laying down, different activities, all sorts of ways and contexts to practice mindfulness. We're going to focus in on the anatomy section today. And in Bhikkhu Analayo's method of practicing Satipatthana, I think there's a couple of dozen in the total sutta, in the whole teaching, there's a couple of dozen different ways to practice, and he whittles kind of all of that down to 7 primary practices. And there are 3 different body practices that he teaches as being part of what he would call the earliest version, the earliest teaching of the foundations of mindfulness. And those 3 body practices are anatomy, elements, and death. So I'm going to read from the anatomy section because that's what we're going to focus on today. Don't be taken back because it's a little bit different sometimes than we're used to hearing mindfulness of the body discussed. Again, monks, we review the same body up from the soles of the feet and down from the top of the hair, enclosed by skin, as full of many kinds of impurity thus. In this body there are head hairs, body hairs, nails, teeth, skin, flesh, sinew, bones, bone marrow, kidneys, heart, liver, diaphragm, spleen, lungs, bowels, mesentery, contents of the stomach, feces, bile, phlegm, pus, blood, sweat, fat, tears, grease, spittle, oil of the joints, and urine. It's a heavy list. Just as though there were a bag with an opening at both ends full of many sorts of grain, such as hill rice, red rice, beans, peas, millet, and white rice. And a man with good eyes were to open it and review it thus: this is hill rice, this is red rice, these are beans, these are peas, this is millet, this is white rice. So too he reviews the same body. In this way, with regard to the body, we abide contemplating the body internally. We abide contemplating the body externally. We abide contemplating the body both internally and externally. We abide contemplating the nature of the arising, the passing away, and both arising and passing away in the body. So that's the section on anatomy. And first of all, like some of those parts of the body that are listed is kind of interesting because typically we might not even think of them as parts of the body. We might think of them as things that we excrete or whatnot, because we tend to think of parts of the body as being like bones, organs, skin, things like that. So there's other things in the list that clearly constitute the makeup of our body, but very often we don't typically like to include, maybe because we think some of them are gross. So we don't tend to think of them as like part of the body. But clearly the Buddha includes those in this teaching. I think I'm going to have to unmute here. All right, so let's get back to this. I think I was saying something along the lines of maybe we don't think of these often as part of the body because we think of them as a little bit gross, right? Maybe that's something that comes into our mind. And typically when we're instructed to bring mindfulness to the body, it's very often an experiential sense of the body, right? Like get in touch with the feeling of your feet hitting the floor, get in touch with different sensations of maybe pressure, softness, and all that. And that is in the Satipatthana Sutta, but that tends to be more in the elements realm. What we're asked to do with this practice is actually contemplate the makeup of the body. And we call this particular part of mindfulness with the body an asubha practice. And asubha basically means not desirable or not beautiful, depending on how you want to translate that, right? And it's early on in the teaching with mindfulness of the body because we have a tendency to cling to our bodies. We have a tendency to find bodies attractive. We have a tendency to find other people's bodies attractive. We have a tendency to look in the mirror and try to make our own bodies more attractive. Or we have a tendency to, say, have a particular attitude towards our body because it's not as attractive as we wish it was or as it used to be. The whole gamut of ways that we cling to our body. And of course, this clinging comes in the form of actual clinging, like seeking after beauty and pleasure through the body, but it also comes in the form of like having aversion to the body because of clinging to, say, ideas about the body. So we have this practice with anatomy, which is sometimes called 32 parts of the body, because I think that's the number that's listed right here. So we have this practice with the body to a certain extent as a way of correcting or getting a more, we'll say, clear or accurate view of the nature of the body. Generally speaking, to move it in the direction of not worth clinging to, not worth becoming attached to. Now, it's important to recognize that what we're talking about here is trying to find a balanced attitude towards the body, a balanced attitude towards these parts of the body. We're not trying to move from one extreme, which would be clinging and attachment to like the beauty in the body, to the other extreme, which would be aversion and disgust for the body, right? So we don't want to be, it's beautiful, and we also don't want to be, it's gross, because those are really two opposite ends of the same type of clinging spectrum, right? Aversion and greed are often very intimately tied with each other, even if they feel different, right? Even if one feels like a leaning in and one feels like a leaning out. Leaning out is still moving in a particular direction. So we're trying to cultivate a fairly balanced attitude. So when we contemplate parts of the body and we contemplate anatomy, and maybe it's what we could think of as gross aspects, it's important to like really get in touch with kind of the attitude of the mind while we're doing it. And if we notice that we are moving in the direction of aversion, it's time to kind of lighten up on the practice. And it might be useful if we're the type of person who already has a lot of aversion or disgust towards our own bodies or the bodies of others. It might be useful to actually practice this a little bit in the opposite direction. And what I mean by that is perhaps you already feel disgust or aversion, and that's what's coming up. It might be useful to actually look at the body in terms of like its usefulness. You might be able to look at like scars as places where you've healed. You might be able to look at, like the signs of aging as the sign of actually having survived. You might be able to look at all of these different parts of the body in terms of their purpose and the ways that they serve us, And so the goal here is to kind of generate a balanced but clear and accurate view of the body, right? There is a story in the suttas where a bunch of monks were practicing this asubha style practice with regards to the body, and then the Buddha left for a month or two somewhere, and they took this practice to an extreme, and when the Buddha came back, the Sangha was significantly diminished. That group of monks was less in number, and he found out that some of them took it so far that they actually committed suicide. And so the Buddha actually then taught them mindfulness of breathing as a counter to taking asubha to its extreme, taking these like what we think of as non-beautiful or non-delightful or non-desirable practices. We're not trying to move in the direction of disgust. So when we practice today, we're not going to, at least in the way that I guide it, we're not going to practice with all of those individual parts. When we practice today, we're going to use Analayo's like kind of introductory method to this, which is to actually do a body scan. And it's pointed at a little bit in the sutta's language itself when it talks about from the soles of the feet and from the top of the head of the hair of the head. So we're going to do a body scan moving down from the head toward the toes, bringing kind of attention to the presence of skin. And then we'll do a body scan from the toes to the head, bringing attention to the presence of flesh. And then we'll do a body scan again from the head to the toes, bringing attention to the presence of bone. So he takes these 32 parts of the body and essentially collapses them into these three categories of skin, flesh, and bone. And as we do this, it's sufficient to recognize their presence. Obviously, it may be difficult to get in touch with like some part of your flesh or some part of your bone. The goal here is not to specifically get this sensation of each part of your skin or each part of your flesh or each part of your bone, but to contemplate their mere presence and recognize that it's not necessarily worth clinging to. So where does regular mindfulness of the body come in here? And this is kind of like key to Analayo's practice, is that we begin all of these Satipatthana practices by establishing what we would think of as a traditional embodied mindfulness. So before doing the body scans, we'll begin by establishing what we think of as embodied mindfulness. The sensation of presence, the sensation of having this body sitting here now, the sensation of being alive, of being in this living, breathing, sitting, breathing body. And we'll use that as kind of like the hub for our practice. So as we move into these contemplations of anatomy through skin, flesh, bones, we'll maintain a sense of embodied mindfulness while we do it. And kind of a teacher, and I suppose it's a little bit of a colleague at this point, his name's Walt Opie. He teaches at Sacramento Insight. He says that this is like really the meat and potatoes of meditation practice, is when we start to train our attention to be able to hold this sense of embodied mindfulness while also practicing something like a contemplation, right? A lot of the times we think that mindfulness has to be just an absolute bare attention, but mindfulness can be present with concepts so long as the concepts don't turn into mental proliferation and going down rabbit holes. So long as the concepts are used, as Analayo would say, as judiciously, onward leading. So do we have any questions, generally speaking, about this theme before we start to try practicing with it? Has anybody practiced with Analayo's method this way before? I know some of you have. No? Okay, so then let's give it a shot.